Hello, everybody. Tom Lynn here, and we are privileged today to again have Dr. Babette Babich on the show with us. And we're going to, we were just going to pick up the thread from what we discussed last time with Gunther Anders, where we talked about his critiques of technology, particularly broadcast technology vis-a-vis the world as phantom and as matrix, but this transposes into a broader set of considerations, some of which address the apocalyptic or the nature of the times in which we find ourselves. That anticipation notwithstanding, of late in the popular discourse, the recent release of Oppenheimer, and his relationship to the atom bomb has made that something of a topic. And in fact, Gunther Anders was at the leading edge of the discourse around the bomb, contemporaneous to that horrific and even demonic act. Though perhaps I go back and forth about that because the kind of singular evil about the use of a nuclear implement that is almost beyond the purview of the demonic. One may almost say that it's a uniquely human kind of evil, but that's neither here nor there. Because my impression is that the Oppenheimer film really is trying to put lipstick on a pig. And let me just, it's just not really grappling adequately with the moral gravity of the bomb. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But let me turn this over to you, because apart from the film, which is just sort of incidental, right? There's the question of how to deal with the moral gravity of the bomb. And I think Anders was early and unique in his apprehension of that. For instance, I was just starting to look at his conversation with Claude Eatherly, where he talks about the incommensurability of our capacity morally to deal with what we can do because of our technicization. So I just got to keep talking. So I'm going to just sort of cut myself off there and just turn it over to you and ask for your thoughts about Anders and so forth.
Well, actually, it's very, very interesting to hear you speak, Thomas, and I'm very glad to be back speaking with you again, because you're touching on a number of very nuanced points and changing directions, as Anders also does. He includes several things, several tones, several layers in his thinking, which I think can make it challenging to follow him, because he interrupts and he has another agenda. So I feel sorry for Claude Eatherly. I have no idea what he would have made of the letters that he got from this German professor who wasn't a professor. What do you do if, and he was, incarcerated for being unbalanced, which was part of the reason Anders wrote to him, because he was out of it. He was out of it, but most of the bombers weren't. So that's something fairly important to think about. Most of those who participated in those bombs, just as most of the German soldiers and the American and French soldiers, didn't really take seriously what they were doing. It was very, very rare for someone to do that. So in a way, Eatherly would have been an exception. But from what I can imagine, having read that correspondence, he wasn't particularly swift. So he mayn't have been the sharpest tool, as we say, in the shed. And that's why I think it was probably pretty horrific. And I think Anders was aware of it, but it didn't bother him. He continued to write. And he continued to write to him because I think he thought it was a way to get a hearing. So he spent a lot of time trying to get that into Anglophone hands. Because it's like his Good Morning Vietnam, which he has his own, actually he didn't call it that. That was Robin Williams, which would have been a better title. That's the movie again. So movies capture our minds. It just hijacked my memory of Anders' own Beautiful Vietnam. And Beautiful Vietnam, which was the book that he wrote really was about what we had done. And I think retirees these days are discovering Vietnam as a place to maybe stretch the American dollar a little further and so on and so forth. And it is beautiful, but the destruction of it is something that Anders wanted to emphasize. But how do you communicate that to the American public? So the very interesting thing is that he had a target, and that was us. He wanted to talk to us. And I think we're feeling sorry for Claude Eatherly is maybe not necessary, because we should feel sorry for ourselves. Because I don't think we got it. I don't think we got it then. I don't think we get it now, because part of what he wanted to argue was that we had, this is the technology point, developed a bit of technology, which, if it were true, and you know, there are a lot of debates saying, just how dangerous are the bombs? Just how destructive are they? So a lot of people have skeptical questions. I don't care one way or the other. And Anders didn't care. What he cared about was the fact that we had developed a bomb or a weapon. And you could compare that with any other weapons. Any of the new weapons, whether it's weather modification or genetically modified organisms, the new type of instead of Roundup, they're using another type of pesticide, which will apparently lower sperm cell count, and all kinds of terrible things. We develop things that destroy. And that, I think, is true, whatever, you know, conspiracy might be a cup of tea. It's certainly not a conspiracy that the things we develop are dangerous, and that using them, you called it demonic, is a kind of insane thing to do, because this was Anders' insight. We effectively couldn't use them. We use things that we can't use. And of course, that's also the whole point at the time of mutually assured destruction. That was the policy. It isn't his interpretation. It is exactly what was understood. We will have these weapons, which will be impossible for anyone to use. And so other nations will develop them, and it will be impossible to use. And Anders took that to philosophy, to think about time.
Think about time. Could you just elaborate a little bit more about that last point, to think about time, temporality, explicate his position there?
Sure, that's actually something that he never let go of. That was the middle of his book, the first book that he wrote, The Antiquatedness of the Human Being, which we translate as obsolescence. But being without time was what that was. And of course, at the time, it wasn't Oppenheimer, it was Beckett. And there was a more interesting reflection. Samuel Beckett's whole endgame was very, very much part of that concern. And of course, Anders also thought about that vis-a-vis Waiting for Godot, which was another God-focused, again, the reference, your wonderful reference to the demonic, God-focused. And that was, given that his wife, at that point, they had been divorced for several years, but Hannah Arendt was also writing about Satan, about the devil. And everyone was playing with the bon mot that the devil's greatest trick was really to persuade sophisticated, smart people that he doesn't exist. And of course, it's true. I mean, you may be advanced enough to believe in an angel or angels. That's a beautiful thing. But most people really don't quite believe in the demonic. They don't believe in the devil, and even Heidegger. And that's something I believe is a correspondence between Gunther Anders and his teacher, Heidegger. You know, everyone reads one another, even if they don't notice or say so. At least if they're German, they do. I think Americans don't read at all, but Germans do. And I think Heidegger would have been aware of what Anders was writing. And I do think that, and I know that he would have been aware of the claim that was being made by Hans Jonas and others at the time. And that was that there was a demonic essence. So when you read the question concerning technology or Heidegger's later reflections, one will see him falling over himself to repeat that there is nothing demonic about technology. It's an extraordinary statement. But he is, because you think, well, yes, sure. But even Goethe would say there was, you know, that Faust is Mephisto. If it's anything, it's Mephisto. So Mephistopheles is Faust. It's not Dr. Faust, it's actually the spirits that appear and the devil that comes to tempt him.
So, and I'm sorry, this is a bit thick, but
Oh,
when Anders says being without time, what is he intending by that suggestion? Is he simply talking about the erasure of our relationship with history? Or is there something, not that that is a thing without depth, or is there something deeper that he's trying to access? What does he mean, for example, as a secondary, more focused way of asking that question? What does he mean phenomenologically? Or if you don't like if one doesn't care for the adverb phenomenologically, what does he mean experientially when he is suggesting that we are at a place where we are encountering a being without time?
okay. It's complicated again, but what
Forgive me,
has
forgive me if I'm,
no,
if my
no,
question is incompetent, so.
it's a huge question. Hans Jonas writes the phenomenon of life, and who previous to that wrote on Gnosticism, which is a very, very complicated, a really complicated discussion that the very young Jonas simply wrote and galvanized a whole range of reflection on the history of Gnosticism and what it actually meant, since most theologians and most philosophers act as if there were no such thing. And of course there is, it's just that it's the most successfully repressed doctrine. Now, what that means, what that refers to is more than I can say in a sentence or hours or days, because we're missing all of the bits and pieces. It's not because it's super complicated. It's because we don't have everything. You know, we don't have all the elements that are involved. But we do have a tradition of people talking about it. And in this particular case, that has to do with the end of time. And it has to do with the idea of an end time when, and of course, that maps neatly onto messianistic thinking, Walter Benjamin, Gershom Scholem, a whole range, and of course, everybody's Sunday school. So there's a lovely collimation there where you can begin to understand what's going on with that. But Anders' point is, he's interested in technology, so he's not sitting there saying, oh gosh, now I'm remembering my time when I was learning to read Torah. He's not doing that. He was trained as a Jew, but that's not what he's doing. What he's going back to instead is, none of that matters, because with the bomb, we now have something, or with whatever it is we come up with, we now have something which will allow us to effectively wipe ourselves out of history in an important way. And because he is trained in understanding what history is, he says the same thing that Heidegger says in Being and Time, which is, before Newton, the laws of Newton were not true. Now, what that means, sounds really, how absurd is that? But what that means is that until you have human beings, this is the old philosophical problem, right? If a tree falls in a forest, does anybody hear it? But what that means is, if you don't have Newton to discover his laws, the laws aren't sitting there out there waiting to be found. They're not true. They require an articulation. And when they have that, then you can call them true. You can't call them true otherwise. They weren't true. And after human beings have passed, this is the key to Gunther Anders' point, because Anders remains a good student of Heidegger. Once you have eliminated human beings from the face of the earth, you no longer have a history of humanity. It's not as if another aliens will come, find our bits of dust on the first face of the earth and say, oh, there were people, here's what they did. None of that will happen. And that's Anders' point. It will be as if we never were. And of course, the future that we might have had, we will have eliminated as well. His point is, we eliminate the future by apocalypse, and we eliminate the past at the same time, because the only people who can pay attention to the past, the human historical past, the human prehistorical past, archaeological past, is us. So without our being there, it's also the very, you said existential, it's the very mortal problem of your own existence. After you are no more, the only person who will care about that won't even be the people who loved you. It's a very, very, very difficult thought to think. This is the whole question of consciousness, of what it is to be a subject. When you are no longer here, there will be those who will miss your presence, but not in the way that you do, and not as you do. And it will always also, this is The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Leo Tolstoy's beautiful short story. It'll always all be about them. It will never be about you. But he was Russian, very, very pessimistic. So,
so to respond, I think that there are a few different things at hand there. One is that it helped elucidate, for me in any event, well, it's not just a question of time, it's a question of what constitutes the true. And there's a tendency in American Anglo circles, I think, to even now reduce the notion of the true to the notion of the fact, the question of mere facticity, its suchness, its correctness, the aspect of the truth as the correct. This is a very small part of the true. And the thing, I believe the Heideggerian framing derives from the notion of the human being, of Dasein, as being a kind of clearing, right? There's a clearing in which being discloses itself. And within, is this correct? So if you take the person of Newton in his place at a specific point in history, he was that being there where this aspect of, I guess, aspect of being disclosed itself and became true within the spirit of the clearing of his mind, and then he closed it. And the in his laws and so forth, which kind of make up the house of being in which we live, to sort of provisionally sort of wax kind of Heideggerian, but that's, which I do just for the sake of the argument, because there's problems with that framing. But that being said, vis-a-vis Anders, the point is that with the arrival of the nuclear weapon, with the arrival of do-it-yourself apocalypse, as it were, you have essentially devastated the clearing within which being shows itself. Yes. You have, if you like, what you have done is you have, if you let us, for the purpose of the conversation, grant a kind of creationist vantage, not in the sense of Christian fundamentalism or anything like that, but let us say that we live in creation and that we are recipients of a created universe. It is a kind of gift. It is a grace of gratuity of the divine. And now, because we have arrived at the capacity to end that gift on our own terms, we have insulted that gratuity. And if you like, even sort of forsaken ourselves as legitimate heirs to it. If the attainment of meaning is connected with realizing some sort of relationship with that transcendent ground out of which this gift of creation arises, then we certainly find ourselves in a pickle. Is that would you say I've grasped what you were articulating?
It certainly is the pickle. It is the pickle. But Anders likes to move. He also has this crazy image, which I find very intriguing, of sort of being on a turntable or waiting for your luggage to be collected, etc., where things are sort of spinning around, and a very physical one. And to a certain extent, and he thinks that one can be dislodged from that circle, from that circuit, from that movement in life, or that could be related in some way. I couldn't do it, but it could be related to the open if someone were so inclined. But for Anders, the real thing is the sheer concrete or ontic quality of this. It's not that it's the ontological dimensionality which gets him. It's the ontic basicness of it, that for the first time you have, Nietzsche spoke, he said, he ate us a gap between two nothingnesses, because you do not need the hypothesis of God, hypothesis non fingo. You do not need to assume deity. You do not need to assume dispensation. You do not need to assume a metaphysical gift. You can if you want, but you don't need to. Because for Anders, the problem is, as atheist as you like, the real issue here is that you're wiping away time. And you're wiping away time because, and the physicists can debate till again, let's go back to that metaphor, the cows come home, as long as they like about what time is or is not. In order to have this for us, and for observant Jews, you need a recording angel, but for human beings, you still need there to be human beings to say, that was then, this is now. We like to imagine, because we're all secretly Andy Warhol, I guess, that there's we're on video right now. So we like to think that you could have a Namjoon constantly repeating vision of this discussion that would go on to infinity, but it won't. And that's Anders' point. So Anders' point is that you're eliminating, without witnesses, without those who say it was, without those who say it is, without those who say it will be, you're eliminating time. And time isn't anything else as far as it matters in terms of history. You don't, if you, historically speaking, so in terms of what will matter, you are taking away any possibility of witness. You are taking away any possibility of a story to be told. And this is maybe for Anders, who was also an expert on Kafka, something that was inevitable, but that's a point that he means to make. You have eliminated what counts as time. It's an Augustinian understanding of time, more than, but that's also Heidegger, that's also Husserl. That's as phenomenological as it gets.
So I do have a sort of second, a smaller question, but to sort of come back at that one more time. In other words, what we have to appreciate is the unique role of the human in, I guess it may not be the universe, but it is our universe, one way or the other, de facto. And if you eliminate the human, then you really do eliminate time, because, or history. I'm inclined to make this distinction between time and history, maybe because I'm in the thrall of how the word time sounds to me. When you say time, I don't necessarily connect it to the historical, at least to me, the connotation of that word elicits a more sterile sense of unfolding. It's time as a mathematical construct, really a kind of Cartesian or Galilean or Newtonian time, or even an Einsteinian time, but a time which is articulable formulaically, and thus we attempt to say a time which is not contingent on the participation of the observer. Whereas there's no narrative structure to it. It's just a dimension which can be mapped. Whereas history suggests that there's something occurring narratively that unites the subjects that are participating in its unfolding. So that's maybe why I'm sort of ambivalent or uncertain as to proceed in the conversation. But let me ask you this question, which is almost a philological question. Well, it is kind of a philological question, right? Like the German word for time is Zeit,
Yes.
right? How does that sound to the German ear as opposed to how the English word time sounds to the English or the American ear.
Well, you can say it's Zeitigt in German. You can say times. We don't quite say it the same way in English, and it doesn't mean, but Zeitigt would be to say that time takes place, eventuates, or happens, that it is now occurring, transpiring. And that's a more, if you like, immediate or concrete notion of an idea of time. You can also have your X, Y, Z, Einsteinian, Asimovian vision of time. But the problem with that is that that's a human description no matter what. And if you had aliens, maybe, and I don't believe this is true, but if you had aliens who were sort of floating around in some other dimension and experiencing time in some other way, they simply wouldn't agree with anything that I have said or that you have said. They just wouldn't. And they wouldn't because they wouldn't be experiencing it in that way. And the same thing would be true of stars and galaxies. The tremendous distances of time and space at the universe, even what we can see with our telescopes, assuming that event horizon is what we take it to be, which is, of course, a tremendous conceit, and we're very conceited.
Yes, I mean, you can sort of consider on the other end of the spectrum, the subjectivity of an insect who lives, for 2 to 3 days, right? They must consider us, almost, like gods, right? To span, so many of their lifetimes, right? So, and then even on the subatomic, things happen so subatomically, so fast, right? 1001, right? Like all the things that just happened in this past second of utterance, right? But that's
why if you bring in the subatomic, I mean, and then I always think it's important to add Heisenberg to Einstein. If you bring in that very, very small, you have even less of a claim on what that time will be, because your observer will always disrupt. So there's a tiny problem there. It's a big problem.
So,
and that's, of course, I think where Anders is really going. When we do this, when we drop this bomb, when we manage to destroy everything, we're taking away our own past. And I think we have this great ego where we do think that there will be aliens who will come and scratch up the little bits of us that are left. This is an absolute the word I used, conceit. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to be true. Just in the same way that people don't really worry about the minutiae of someone else's life. They don't. And certainly aliens won't.
Now, it would at best be a kind of curiosity.
Right. Sure.
Consider we're not really, mourning the dinosaurs, as it were.
Yes,
the life of the individual Tyrannosaurus Rex,
right. And we don't talk about that. So I mean, we have a bone, and that's enough for us.
But we've talked so far about nuclear technology, but that's just one kind of technology, and it's sort of transparently destructive in a way which you can find people who will mount an apologetic for it, but I think that the sincere apologists of nuclear weapons are few and far between, happily. What I mean by that is people who will actually stand there and suggest that there's something morally positive about them. Most people won't go that far. Most people will appeal to just the terrible force of necessity. That obviously these things are destructive and evil beyond redemption, but that is not the nature of this world. We live in an unredeemed and unredeemable world, and that is what grounds something like the policy of mad or mutually assured destruction. That's not an apology. That's they just don't address the conversation as to the moral gravity of what's happening. Which, to circle back to Eatherly and the other pilots and the apparent capacity of the other pilots to acclimatize or to assimilate, or you could look at the awful suggestion of Harry Truman that his only regret was that he didn't marry earlier in life, right? There's this vacuity there, a vacuity which is little more than an evasion. So there's a latent sense of latent admission as to the monstrosity of something like nuclear weapon. But this is not, I think, simply a question of these terrible implements. We turn now to other kinds of technology, such as, most pointedly, I would say, pretensions of biological technology. I say pretensions because I'm not really persuaded as to what capacities are claimed by medical technology, but that's irrelevant. The fact is that they are attempting to interfere with the processes of life in radical ways. And does this also connect to the elimination of time? I would say it does. I would say it also relates to another aspect of Anders' thoughts, particularly perhaps in Promethean shame, the notion that we are wanting to be merely constructed, confabulated entities as opposed to created entities. But maybe you can say something about those two things, the relationship, at least in principle, of Anders to questions of genetic manipulations, life extension, therapy, things and so on like that. And then also sort of this issue of Promethean shame.
Oh, that's a difficult question. And it's so difficult because we get very triumphalist when we talk about all our inventive capacities, whether it's, Bikini Atoll, the capacity to most destructive bomb test there ever was, and of course others that are not talked about, one can assume. But Anders thought that the problem was that built into technologies of that kind was the need to develop advanced versions of those nuclear weapons that were less destructive. He found that absolutely fascinating. He's right. Most of us don't pay attention to neutron bombs and what they're all about, but they're really about what, to a certain, from a very sardonic perspective, the last 3 years was really all about, which would be to destroy as much as possible, but have less mess. So there's less to have to clean up and less to have to worry about. So if you could spare the buildings and you could spare the bridges, after 2 world wars, the powers that be would like to have less mess on the ground. And if neutron bombs will allow that, tiny micro nukes will allow that. It's just a little bit of destruction rather than the whole thing being wiped clean. You really don't want that, because then you've got to rebuild it all again. So if you can keep it, if you just can have sort of the zombie landscape where the zombies are wandering around, but basically the malls and the roads are still intact, that would be a glorious possibility. The other question.
Lullian, sir.
No.
It's very Elulian, right? The
It is.
technology is committed to maximal efficiency, and there's more. Morality is completely destroyed, and as I read Elul, the moral is evacuated. There is no moral in the world of technique. And then this is really exemplified in the idea of modifying, refining the capacity of weapons of mass destruction so that you can do it in the most quote unquote surgical way, right? Oh, these are surgical hits so that we can minimize the collateral damage. We can cauterize and prevent a kind of, metastasization of the trauma, and then we'll be able to claim the infrastructure and repurpose it for the ultimate imperatives of the machine, of the system, whatnot, right? So that's a very Elulian way of seeing it as opposed to Anders. But obviously their thoughts work well together. But that's just an interjection on my part.
No, I agree with you. I think they do work well together. Anders is only always pointing to the kind of sardonic, the kind of strange paradox that it's not progress. So that if your latest and newest bomb is one that does less damage, that's not really a new and improved bomb, you could argue. Because the only way to use it, which is the point of the mutually assured destruction, is if it's not that damaging. Because if you go for the bigger and bigger bomb, it's really less and less and less of an opportunity to use it because it's just too much of a problem. If you develop a death ray, you can kind of use it only once if everyone is destroyed when you do. So there's this Flash Gordon-esque aspect to the kind of way that he's thinking about this. And
But there's almost like a Pyrrhic logic to it, right? You want to avoid the Pyrrhic victory
right.
of a hydrogen bomb.
Right. But he
You
thought
don't you don't have it. You've so decimated your opposition that you can't even glory in their humiliation. So,
But the Promethean point, which is the point you asked about, and it's a really crucial one, is for him, and what ties into the biological elements of it, is the shame that we have, and we've had it actually since Descartes, of not being perfect. We just can't stand not being perfect, and we want our medicine to make us perfect. We want our technologies to make us perfect. We want to be other than we are. And that, of course, was Anders' favorite Goethe fairy tale, which is the Zauberlehrling, the Fantasia story, which is the story which is very much modern technology, where we've got all these things, we don't quite understand them. And I think I started in biology, and I think that is true. I think we don't quite understand what we're doing. And it's not that we have the power to do all kinds of things. We really don't. All of our stem cell treatments, etc., always kill the people in the end. But we're committed to doing it because we believe that it's going to save us eventually. And everyone who dies on the way is just, collateral damage is the word you used before. But the Promethean shame is this desire to be as gods. And the fact that we're not and that's another side of Gnosticism, is what upsets us most. What Anders talks about as missing in being in time is sex, which is always nice, but also toothaches, which is not so nice. There's no mention of toothaches in being and time. And that for him was a problem, because whatever Heidegger's existentialism was doing, it didn't have room for the most real experience. Think of we know that cavemen practiced trephination, which means we know they had tremendous tooth pain because they had such pain that they drilled holes in their skull to release the pressure, which is also something consistent with the terrible abscess. Right. So it's a very human thing. It has been human ever since we have been human on this earth. And there's no discussion of pain in being in time. So that's, of course, a very interesting question, where pain is the German word is Leiden, which is suffering, Leidenschaft. Why boredom is there? Being in time is a sustained analysis of boredom and anxiety, which are pretty bourgeois things to talk about. There are other things you could talk about. You could talk about a toothache, or you could talk about sex. Right? And so those are Anders' big objections. But the Promethean shame goes back to that desire not to be subject to toothaches, not to be subject even to sex. Because one of the great advantages, I think the Barbie movie, I haven't seen the Barbie movie, but every one of us has seen a Barbie doll. And it's not really a lot of sex going on in Barbie dolls. For Ken or Barbie, it doesn't matter. It's either sort of equal opportunity sexlessness for small plastic dolls.
What's amusing, so this is, I don't know how true this is, because but it seemed plausible because Netflix, they've got this series of toys that made it, and they had an episode on Barbie, which came out several years ago before this. And they talk about the origin of Barbie, and there's this kind of irony, because the origin was that the woman who came up with it, they went on vacation to Europe, and they were in Amsterdam, and there was this doll. I can't remember the name of the doll. It was essentially the Barbie doll. It wasn't called Barbie. It was a doll that was sold ironically to sailors as a representation of a prostitute. She was a prostitute doll, right? And I mean, that's what it was. It was an ironic little product, and she just reframed it to be Barbie. She brought that doll back to the United States, and right. So there's this disjunction, and then there's the narrative of what it is to be a human being and how relationship to sex in America. It's very, very odd. You get all these weird incongruities and juxtapositions. But anyway,
So think of Alan Rickman in the playing this Metatron, voice of God, and he appears as an angel. And of course, in order to persuade the chosen of God, who's having no part of this, not as far as to persuade her, he sort of, I'm not going to rape you. I couldn't possibly, because I'm like a Ken doll. And he strips to show that. That's what there's no, you can certainly, like the Venus of Hottentot was probably used as a pornographic thing for cavemen, I guess. But there's no sex that the statue's having, and there's no sex that the doll is having, because there's no possibility. It's not an option for the doll. In any case, for us, we sexualize it massively. You're totally right. I agree with you there.
But the thing about the irony of genetic manipulation is that it wants to eliminate that from our existence, really. And that actually comes up pretty transparently in lots of trans. I still am amazed at whenever I read material from committed transhumanists, it just seems like something written by someone who is trying to caricature transhumanists, but they evidently really want this particular world, which is really bizarrely sterile. The notion that of being able to make the whole process of reproduction utterly synthetic, utterly customizable. It seems to me prima facie doesn't even really deserve the label madness. It doesn't even deserve the dignity of insanity. It's so empty. It's so bloodless that I can't be convinced that these people are sincerely walking into that future. But apparently there are people who are sincerely excited about that future. And I don't know what to make of that.
They would like clones. And that's, of course, is part and parcel of that chapter. And I think Christopher Müller has a translation of the Prometheanism, Gunther Anders' own Promethean discussion, which is this great frustration of, you can look at it in terms of someone who's about to die. They can't fix us. So there's this desire that the body should be like a car you take to the shop, and they switch out the bits, and then you get everything replaced and you're good as new. The idea, however, eliminates youth. It eliminates mistakes, and all of the celebrations of Eros that you see in Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which just disappear completely. You don't have any of that charge of the natural world. And the erotic, that's gone. All you have is some cloned new body that you can, because you have sufficient money, simply download your consciousness to. Get rid of the body that's old. And there's a lot of trust involved in this, and sort of assume that the new downloaded you will be just the same or just fine in the new young body. But that, again, Anders' language about time is very, well, I think, revealing, because all of that's missing. It's also the same way that this will happen with the surrogacy. One of the things that happens for all of us, and we don't pay lots of attention to it because we don't remember it, but the Chinese will count from the moment of your conception, your years and on this earth, because the time in your mother's womb was also time you lived and felt. Wipe that away, and now it's only going to begin when you're adopted, when, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And everything else doesn't exist. And that's a very important thing that we do. And that does go back to the way that Anders talks about the very interesting way we deal with time, because we decide that time begins, countable time begins year one, when a certain Jesus is born. All the years before, none matter. Only from then. And so with that stroke, we've already eliminated time. Mayans forget them, Chinese, whatever, forget them. And so I think that's a lot that's been lost. It seems to me. Seems to me. So I call that the imperialism of the past, colonialization of the past. So all of the other peoples who could count don't count. And their ways of counting don't count. The ways of Australian Aborigines who don't have writing, their dream time don't count to us at all.
Well, I mean, what I think is ultimately terrifying is that we also do not count. When you draw the logic of this progressivism to its final conclusion, when we come to the point of the singularity, the Kurzweilian singularity, where we are, one with the machine, then the contempt for all times before that will be incapable of exaggeration. There'll just be this utter negation of history as a kind of unfortunate cosmic accident, because now we are living in the mechanized eternity of the server. And I mean, so none of it counts, right? None of it, including the imperialism of time, right? Because they will ultimately destroy Western time as well.
Right.
And this attaches directly to the insight of Anders with respect to the significance of the bomb. It's not just that the bomb will destroy time by literally destroying human beings. The project of technology will reconfigure what we now call civilization into something utterly unrecognizable and which is anti-civilizational. Because I think part of civilization is to encounter the wild nature of the universe. And the project of technology is a project of total domestication, which is incommensurate with meaningful freedom, as I see it. But that's me going on there for a bit. So
he would agree with you. He would agree with you. Marcuse would agree more, but he would certainly agree. Alul would agree. I think where I think we need as a nation to think a little more is our own place, because I think that the tendency to use the word we is a vast exaggeration in any future possible configuration of what counts as the new technology ahead of us. Cloning, for example, is not something that can be for everyone, and it requires incredible destruction of life in order to even get to that possibility. You've got to have all of the failed attempts. Biology is like dog breeding in general. You got to drown a lot of puppies. So it's a very, very, very great difficulty. All of those failed versions have got to be sacrificed, and often in the most brutal way. So there's not a lot of we's. There's a great, that I think is something that people don't really realize. They think, well, there'll be an option for me if I want, without paying attention to the tremendous mess on the way. And there's rather a lot of it. So that's
but there's also just, I'm sorry, I just have to insert that there's also this, there's a fundamental stupidity to that vision, because you are not your clone. It's a different subjectivity. You can, a human being can be born of that in principle, I suppose, but that's a different person. That is not you. To seek continuity by that avenue is to misunderstand consciousness so egregiously that I don't even know where to begin the conversation. You don't understand that is not you, right? The cryogenic model is a little bit more feasible. You're just like asleep, asleep. right? But there's a refusal to to countenance the fact of one's own death is inevitably part of one's life.
Should be, but that's what's denied. And of course, the refusal of that is part of the Promethean, if you like, shame. That is the anger. I mean, people, and you see this in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, people get angry at the idea of death. It's not something people are happy about. It's very, very difficult to be happy about. Nietzsche said it should be a great celebration, a great festival. But I don't think the average person responds to it in that way at all. And that anger is the other side of this shame, which that it shouldn't be happening. Why is it happening? So when you go back and read what Anders has to say about it, it's not himself saying it, but he's being fair about the people he's visiting in hospital or the reports that others have, as well as the conviction that the only source of error is human and not the machine.
You mean that he wishes to emphasize that there is an abiding human agency? That part of the problem of the current impasse is it very effectively conceals the extent of our own complicity in this process? Is that what you mean?
No, he's talking about what I think was the an Air Force instructor who was talking to his cadets.
Okay.
Pointing out to them that look, you guys, when and it is true, when a plane crashes, it's not a technical failure. It's a pilot, it's user error, it's operator error. So it's something that the user is doing. Or when you think about the reason we have all those little blue lights when we land on an airstrip, those blue lights are not there for the pilot to use to guide. They're there for the landing system that was devised because human beings will always crash when they land, because we didn't evolve to land planes. So you have these automated landing things, systems which were developed in large part through the work of a fellow named Gibson, who talked about certain affordances, and he at MIT and had helped, of course, basically the Air Force and the Navy devise ways to not have to train so many pilots, because if pilots crash, you got to go get new ones. It's a great problem. So this was, and after World War II, that was the one thing that the U.S. military really knew and knew very well, that pilots would crash, and they would crash constantly when landing. So you develop means to, that's why landing is never an important part of pilot training, because it's not really something pilots are very good at. Some of them can be good at them, and if you have the Hudson, you're in luck. But in fact, we don't have our perception is not really designed to go from very high distances down that fast and then hit the ground. It's a real problem. And people who do extreme sports like skydiving, they experience some of these things. And you have to compensate for the fact that your own eyes are not quite accurate.
So sorry I didn't follow you for a second. So because if you draw that logic out, right, as I recall that talk, then you can proceed to understand that that means if it's a pilot error, the pilot is part of a technical problem. Yep. By extension, the engineer on the back end of the product, which is a pilot, apparently made some mistakes. And so there's an effort to improve on the effort of that engineer to modify the human product. Is that where we're getting at here? So
sure. Autopilot, whenever you get on a plane, your plane lands perfectly almost all the time because your pilots never do it. So they simply don't touch the landing controls. That's done automatically. Autopilot lands. And that is the Prometheanism. So the cadets would like to be as perfect as that landing machine device, be as good as the autopilot, but they're not. And they're not because of their own eyes. Their own eyes do not give them the kind of information they need to make that landing a smooth and perfect landing every time, 100 out of 100. But the machine does.
What I meant was, though, that fact of that human limitation then becomes, to move beyond just the example, a reason to say that the human is something we have to move beyond.
Yes.
you get to the transhuman, where
Yes.
we can, that's where I was going with that.
What's
So,
that's I agree.
oh,
That's what they think. That is the desire. And if you get a perfected human being without these flaws.
and so yeah, I need to have
Hmm.
I need to have someone on to, assume this position, right? To offer an apology. Like there would be factors to pretend that there isn't something appealing about perennial youth, right? There's an appeal to some things that can be won from some of these perspectives, but it just seems very, very Faustian. Like you even mentioned, I'm just kind of talking, forgive the lack of systemicity here, but you mentioned, for instance, the stem cell therapy, and I started to look a little bit into it because of concern for some people who have chronic pain problems, things like that, and there, are limited applications where it does seem that stem cells that kind of therapy can be potentially beneficial. But what was really disturbing to me about when you start looking into the actual process, like what is concretely happening. And this is about a year and a half ago, so the details escape me. But what I recalled clearly at the time, reading about the processes of how the stem cells are harvested and subject to certain manipulations, is it all had this feeling of thievery. It was like you're taking away from something. You're taking away from your own youth or someone else's youth in order to put that youth somewhere else in a very disturbing, I would even say, kind of dark, magical fashion. It felt like a kind of black magic, which may sound kind of superstitious of me, but I mean that pretty literally. Where was I going with that? I don't know. I'm sorry. I was just kind of.
Well, it could be the Tour de France. The Tour de France is the same way. I mean, it where you have elite athletes simply bank some of their own blood, or get the blood of younger athletes, even better, in order to, after a certain etape, a certain stage, simply have a transfusion and get that fresh new blood, because that's going to increase their performance. If
That's
it's their own
insane.
blood, that's if it's their own blood, that's great. But if it's younger blood, then it's a little bit doping.
That's insane to me. I mean, I
But they
actually
do it.
wasn't.
This is also done. I mean, this has been done
All
for a
right.
long time.
The other thing that to me, all right, I gotta calm down. I wasn't aware of that
I don't mean
specifically,
that that's, I mean,
but
I'm just saying that is a, I mean,
it's a
they
practice.
use steroids too. So,
Right, it's a practice, but
you know,
something about the use of blood is sort of primarily evocative. But
it's the
it's
fastest way.
it's
The
it
fastest way
segues
is with blood.
into a different question, and that, to me, it's the where is the question of honor in these affairs? Okay, where if the metric against which victory is measured simply reduces to the term of quantifiable performance, are you not losing sight of what is most important about contest, which is not actually the attainment of concrete results, but an engagement of your own finitude within that clash and what that exposes you to? It seems that by constantly trying to give yourself advantages of that ilk, you are not living from a sense of true honor as a competitor or what have you, which might actually feel that this connects to a broader problem of the ethical orientations of our time. It doesn't seem we have ethical orientations. Let's say perhaps a hyperbolic statement, but it might be able to sort of round us back to Anders and his concern, and maybe bring us to sort of a moment of adjournment, if not coda, right? Because if everything is just a question of performance and manipulation and attainment, what is the basis of true ethical discernment?
That's a difficult and different question. The only reason I'm sorry for upsetting with the reference to the blood transfusion.
Oh, no, I'm not.
It's just that was simply in response to your comment on the stem cells, because it is the case that is the most effective way to rejuvenate. So the most effective way to rejuvenate, we're back to monkey glands, is in fact the blood of younger people. And it works for athletes who are exhausted at the top of a mountain, even if it's their own younger blood or someone else's younger blood. And it's also for correcting age and our research on age, the most effective way. So if one doesn't talk honestly about the mechanism that's used, when we talk about these fighting age or rejuvenation, one doesn't pay attention to that. I think there's a certain blindness, and that's something that Anders wanted to talk about, which was in fact the use of human and human beings as raw material. It's also something that Heidegger talks about. So it's not just that the coal is a raw material, it's not just that water becomes a resource for hydropower, but also the human being becomes a raw material, and that can become very unpleasant. And that's the reason the villagers stampeded the Frankenstein castle. Right? That was the reason. They weren't just crazy, didn't like science. They were upset because the children were being harmed, because they were worried about they just, being peasants, automatically anticipated that they would be next, and they just didn't like the idea. He was using dead body parts, but what if he decided to use live body parts? It's a great problem. And of course, we do use live body parts today. It's called transplanting. Right? So you need to keep the body alive until the moment that the organ is harvested. That's necessary.
It occurs to me, I apologize. I don't apologize. I was upset by the remark, but not because you made it. But it just, to me, things happen, and at some point the decision was made that this is okay, this is what we're going to do now. And things like, at some point the decision was made that it's acceptable for the cyclists to get blood transfusions in the midst of the competition. To me, the very fact that was accepted as acceptable, if you'll pardon that use of the same verb twice in a single sentence, is just it's disgusting to me. But that sort of thing happens in professional sports all the time. The examples are legion, right? Doping in general, or you can talk about how on online chess people will use, and to me it's still sort of enigmatic psychologically, but they will use, they will cheat. They will use a computer engine to cheat and playing another opponent online, things like that. These sort of enhancements to create the impression that one is more adept than one actually is, or more capable, more enduring than one actually is, are just acts of astonishing bad faith. And by the implication, I suppose, if I was to exaggerate my position, is that much modern technology draws us into a relationship of bad faith with ourselves.
I agree.
And in terms of like the human being as resource, an additional instance or example of that is arising in connection with so-called AI technologies. And you get this all the time whenever you go on the internet, whether it's through surveys or this way or that way, there's an effort to record human behavior as fodder to be taken up by so-called AI software to help, quote unquote, train that software. Yes. And it's, to me, kind of a small scandal, the extent to which we all cooperate with this kind of thing. But that's what is occurring with ChatGPT. ChatGPT aggregates all the stuff that human beings have spoken and uttered, written, composed, figured out, and they're reconciliating it using whatever various stochastic mathematics to create this illusion of a conversation, which isn't a conversation, but people are being used as the fodder that is for the canon, which is this incredibly destructive technological pretense, which is AI.
Very destructive, but very much desired, because of course it allows you to eliminate persons, and that's why it's desirable. For example, at university, and this is what really will happen. At university, students write little essays and they get into college, or they don't get into college on the basis of the essays they write. The problem with that is that your various people in the admissions don't want to read those essays. It's tremendous work. If you can have AI read those essays for you, then you can automate the process. The students who are smarter already, and they've already written the essay using the ChatGPT, so they have already automated the essay that is now being automated, and so on and so forth. So this is the great problem, since younger people are using this technology already with tremendous happiness. That's how they text so quickly. They simply use autocomplete. It's part of second nature for them.
Yeah, well, it's actually
like it's just changed my word, but that's me because I'm old. They'll look at it and they're like, yes, and they're surfing it. So,
well, what it is it's a tragic loss in terms of human capacity. Of course, the rejoinder is like, people say that about every new technology, but these technologies are robbing people of not just capacity, but experience.
That's
the
right.
Experience of learning
That's right.
through like deep engagement with the material. This is true across the spectrum. Like I was talking with a carpenter, right? And if you really want to be a carpenter, there's a lot of tedium involved. There's a lot of just sawing and sanding and so forth, and making innumerable mistakes along the way. So there is a time there. There is a time where there's an engagement and a grappling. When the whole process is mechanized, people are deprived of that. And then, by the way, they're also deprived of great capacities. Okay. Similarly, right, in the life of the mind, there is just not going to be a substitution for actually reading the books or actually writing, whether that be longhand or learning to type in a way which is not, by the way, when you give yourself over to the predictive mechanisms and the grammar correct and all the rest, you're allowing your own voice to be shaped by the machine.
That's right. Totally.
In a way that diminishes your creativity. And third, this was like a distinction that to which I was recently recalled of Gabriel Marcel, right now just him, but
sorry, I should have turned that off. I'm very sorry.
no, you're fine. I didn't even notice it. But the distinction is between being creative and productive, right? And you have all these ads for like Grammarly and things like that that are supposed to help you compose. What you're doing is you're being reduced to a producer who is exhibiting output, which would then be taken up by the system. And that is not your highest end. Your highest end, or toward your highest end, is a creativity which is not going to be abetted by reliance on convenience like that.
I agree completely. I think it's insidious, however, because I think that's where the hermeneutic dialectic comes in, and you write to that, speak to that, want that, and that becomes something that is quite subtle. It's a very, very dangerous thing. It's the same way that your experience surfing on the internet is also very, very easily manipulated by a search engine. So that was a long time ago. That was what the internet was hiding from you. Elie Pariser's observations, those remain very salient, I think. We're in a bubble. We're in a bubble, and it's very hard to get out of it. It used to be that the internet was a lot more chaotic, to use your word, and there was more of a chance to discover things you didn't expect. In recent years, that is no longer the case.
So I guess we could be kind of Leninist here and inquire what is to be done, right? Like, and I don't know what Anders thought. I feel like he was a bit dour on that point. But perhaps I'm misreading him there. Or I can ask you, what do you feel is to be done in the light of the present circumstance, such as we have sketched it?
I think you can accept the dour and still try. And I think that that's the most important thing and I think that that's also what Anders said. He doesn't think you're going to succeed. He thinks that does not excuse you. And I think there's such huge truth in that. It's actually very Kantian. Kant's biggest argument against suicide is that, which is that, of course, the only possibility for an unexpected discovery is not simply quitting when the going gets tough. It's the only thing. So since quitting when the going gets ensures there will be nothing, for Kant, the only possibility of a new invention or something that might be unexpected is, in fact, if you go against the odds. And it's the reason that you cannot simply make it your maxim that when future life would just bring you more misery, you simply, make it easier and just take the easy way out. And for Kant, that doesn't work because it eliminates any possibility of scientific or artistic creativity automatically.
Yeah, that's it. That's the stuff. I can't remember who said it. I want to say it wasn't Woody Guthrie, but it was someone. I believe it was, maybe what he was talking about courage, and he said, courage is knowing that you're licked before the start and you show up anyway, right? And I guess that is what is to be done, is just to stand in courageous defiance of the inherited narrative. So,
because you never know. And that beauty of contingency, I think, is what Kant was. That's the scientist in him. He thought that, this would be the way. He was more optimistic than Anders, but Anders still doesn't let us off the hook. You still have to show up. Okay.
well, thank you so much for this chat here. Do you have any other remarks you'd like to append before I let you go here?
Only gratitude. Thank you very much. It's good to speak with you. I've been watching some of your shows, and it's just a great opportunity, and to speak as part of that series. So
You're very kind. Thank you. So
let
me go ahead.
Bye now.
Hold on one second here. Hold on. I was going to